Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So, back to Dave Barry this week, and this is Babies and Other Hazards of Sex. So, this is a book that was published in 1984. So, what you have here is one of those books that in some ways will probably date itself, but in other ways, I don't think it really does because, there's a lot of stuff about early days of childhood rearing that probably doesn't actually change all that much. So there are a lot of pictures, a lot of cartoons in this book. It's a very cartoon-ridden book. It's not that there's no text. There's large amounts of text, but this is one of those books that really sort of earns the illustrations. So, among other things, Dave Barry talks in one of the chapters about the issue of birth control. And this particular picture is from something that dates back to his youth. And since Dave Barry is a child of the 60s, his youth is, now basically some 60-odd years ago. And in that particular, and this particular picture has to do with the fact that apparently, when he was a teenage male, it was very difficult to obtain condoms because you had to buy them at the drugstore from the condom lady who was about 65 and looked like your grandmother, only more moral. She had a photographic memory, so she knew exactly who you were, and as soon as you left the store, she would dial a special number that would connect her with a gigantic loudspeaker system so she could announce to your parents and your teachers and everybody in your church or synagogue and people on the street that you had just bought condoms. It speaks to, and the thing is that this is 1984, but it does speak to the difference generally that we have in society about the notion of birth control, that now that, time was you needed somebody, that they had somebody there who could squint at you and basically morally harass you because, of course, you're not supposed to be having sex before marriage. And now you can get a condom you can get a condom at the drugstore, and now that we have all those self-checkout things at drugstores, you can even get a condom and nobody has to know because you can quietly swipe through all of your stuff yourself through a self-checkout in some stores. Which is very, very different from the 1960s. So, this isn't so much dating itself as being a commentary about the fact that, about, of course, some of the way that things have changed, but also just the difficulties that come with having everybody and their dog knowing that you're having sex, or at least you think that everybody and their dog knows. Also, Dave Barry is a very empathetic human being, and that means that he's very, very well aware of what his wife went through when his wife at the time anyways, what she went through when she was pregnant with their son. And so, he noticed that when his wife was giving birth, that there were a lot of people in the room watching during the course of giving birth. And, and he describes it, that he says, "Let me explain who these people are. You have your obstetrician, unless the hospital operator has been unable to rouse him, in which case he will actually be a life-size obstetrician puppet operated from behind by a nurse trained to mimic obstetricians' voices. You also have your husband, assuming he has been able to wash away little crumbled bits of steering wheel embedded in his hands. Then you have your pediatrician and an anesthesiologist, one nurse to assist each of the doctors, you have 3 medical students, 1 law student, and you have Billy Ray Johnson, who is actually a retired beet farmer who just happens to like hanging around delivery rooms to watch people have babies." And I suspect that there are a lot of women giving birth who probably feel that way. This, oddly enough, actually strikes me as very likely something that his wife brought up at the time. Anyways, this is, of course, as you can tell, an extremely irreverent book. And it's not that, Dave Barry is a terrible father. It's very clear from everything that he writes that he cares deeply about his children. But he's a humor writer. So this is funny. The one thing about this drawbacks of close child-dog relationship, which I think is entirely explanatory. The thing about this, of course, is that this is one of his earliest books. This isn't one of the books that he wrote that does spin off of one of his columns, because I believe that there is a column that dates back to many, many moons ago, probably in the early 80s, that was very much a column about having a baby and having a baby in the house and what it was like and the difficulties involved in it. Because most parents, and I do not count myself among those because I have never been a parent and I have no intention of being a parent, I suspect I read this book when I was far too young and took it very much to heart, because everything in this told me that I'm not a nice enough person to think that any of the myriad things described in this book, yes, in a joking fashion, and yet babies are very, very smelly and they leak in all directions, and it takes literally years before you can even communicate rationally with them, and by that point they're about, 3, and no 3-year-old child has ever been rational. It's not really part of them. In fact, since most people aren't rational, people who fundamentally don't know anything, which is children, are going to be even less rational. So I can't, and I won't. But, there are things that are sufficiently consistent across all of the various types of media in the world that tells you that there are certain truisms about physical and emotional exhaustion, about how bad babies smell when they really get going, and the constant fight to keep them from managing to kill themselves by falling down the stairs, because there are always those children who apparently do not have that instinct that tells them that being high up is a bad thing. There are some children who actually have working survival instincts, and some that really don't seem to, which is true of people in general, of course, because, you go on the internet and people. Dining out with baby is, of course, the bringing up the point that if you take a baby to a very, very nice high-class restaurant, you very much have the problem that you're going to have to change the baby. You're going to have to take care of it. At some point, it will likely start screaming, and it's not going to be that relaxing an evening. So it's an interesting notion and an interesting thought, and I suspect he was describing more of a real event that happened to him than perhaps you would expect from the anecdote, when he describes having gone out to a very nice restaurant with his wife, but also having brought his infant son with him, and the two of them trying to nonchalantly sashay past people with wads and wads of stained baby wipes because they decided to go out to a nice restaurant with a baby. Frankly, I don't know what possessed them, because I never know what possesses people to bring babies to nice places. The babies certainly aren't going to appreciate it. And those people aren't going to appreciate having to deal with the baby in those nice places. So I don't know. It seems like more stress than it's worth, but I suppose people get desperate, don't they? And so let's move on to the last thing here, which is a picture that's on the back. This set of images does appear as line drawings on the interior of the book, but since this is in color, I'm doing this one instead. The modern fiber optics enables us to witness the miracle of fertilization. And the miracle of fertilization in this book is described as the miracle, as basically in exactly the same way you would describe a man who was ultimately successful at managing to get himself a one-night stand by convincing a woman that he's very, very interested in her as a person, and then taking her to bed because that's how it's described. And I suppose you could see the sperm-egg interaction as being that way. Anyway, so as one of Dave Barry's earlier books, it's funny. It's still Dave Barry, but he was much, much younger, and this was published in Pennsylvania. Now, Dave Barry, it's not that he didn't have a career before Miami, but the Miami Herald was where he spent the bulk of his career, and I think it's where his career really took off. And so, while he was a humor writer before then, there is a sense in this book that I feel a certain amount of him still feeling out, still learning his craft and still developing his style. I mean, he's not, super young. It's, the blurb at the beginning about him says that he's 36. So, we're not talking about somebody who's a fresh graduate from university, but but I really think that this, as one of his earliest books, it's good, and I like it, and if you want to read somebody making fun of the whole process of pregnancy, of dealing with very, very young children, and of course asking the closing question of whether you should have another one, because, obviously you'll be able to avoid all of the mistakes that you made with the first one. It does exactly what it says on the tin. So if you want a book that does those things, is not particularly family unfriendly. I mean, I was probably too young to read this when I read it, but that happened with a lot of books. But the thing is, it's my favorite, but it's one of my favorites, but I will freely admit that a certain amount of my favoritism of this book has to do with my personal nostalgia for this being one of the first Dave Barry books that I read. He has produced better books, and of course his collections, his collections of articles are of course cherry picked to be the best and to leave out some of the duds he has no doubt thrown out over the years, because goodness knows, given the sheer number of columns he has to have written across the decades of his career, I can't imagine that every single one of them was a gem, because, there's only so many perfect columns any writer could manage. But it's a good book, and it's fun, and it does exactly what it needs to do. So I think I have aimlessly rattled on and said absolutely nothing interesting, for quite long enough. So if anybody's still listening, thanks for coming by and listening to this, and I will see you all next week.